I was 51 years old the morning I found a life insurance policy with my name on it, taken out by my husband 6 weeks before he tried to have me declared mentally incompetent. The policy was for $800,000. He was the sole beneficiary. I found it in a filing cabinet I wasn't supposed to be able to open anymore. He'd changed the combination. What he didn't know was that I'd watched him set the new one from the kitchen doorway, reflected in the dark window above the sink, while he thought I was already upstairs medicated and asleep. I stood in my own study at 11 at night, holding that policy under a flashlight, and I understood three things at once. My husband of 22 years didn't want a divorce. He wanted something faster. And the woman he'd brought in to help him, the one I'd trusted, the one who sat across from me twice a week and took careful notes and called herself my doctor, she had already signed her part of the paperwork. My name is Diane Calloway, and before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand who I was before it did. I was not a woman anyone would call fragile. I spent 23 years as a contracts attorney for a mid-size firm in Columbus, Ohio. I read fine print the way other people read menus, automatically, before deciding anything. I had a reputation for catching the thing nobody else caught, the buried clause, the off date, the signature that didn't match. Partners called me into deals not because I was the loudest in the room, but because I was the one who read every page before the pen touched paper. I retired at 50 after my mother's death left me enough to stop working and start living. That was what I told people. The truth was that I was tired in a way that didn't show, the kind that comes from decades of protecting other people's interests and never asking who was protecting mine. My husband, Robert, had always seemed like the answer to that question. Robert Calloway was an architect, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who thought 3 moves ahead and made it look effortless. We met when I was 28, married at 29, and for most of those 22 years we were good together. Not passionate, not electric, but solid. I respected him. I believed he respected me. I now know that what I mistook for respect was simply patience. He had been waiting for the right set of circumstances. When I retired and my mother's estate settled, he had them. The first sign was so small I'm still angry at myself for missing it. About 8 months after I retired, Robert suggested I see someone. Not a therapist, a psychiatrist. He said it gently, with that careful architectural precision he brought to everything. He said he was worried about me, that I'd been struggling since my mother died, that I seemed anxious, disoriented sometimes, not myself. I thought he was being attentive. I made the appointment. Her name was Dr. Patricia Voss. 54, silver hair cut close, an office with too many plants and a way of tilting her head when she listened that made you feel genuinely heard. I liked her immediately. That's the part I return to most. I genuinely liked her. She asked good questions. She was warm. She expressed concern in exactly the right measures. Within 3 sessions, she had prescribed me something for anxiety. Within 6, she had added something for sleep. She called it a protocol. I called it help. I was so relieved to have a name for the fog I'd been walking through that I didn't ask enough questions about what was causing it. My daughter asked those questions for me. Nora was 24, finishing a graduate degree in pharmacology at Ohio State, the kind of detail that will matter more in a moment than it does right now. She came home for Thanksgiving and watched me at dinner and didn't say anything until Robert went to clear plates. Then she leaned across the table and said very quietly, "Mum, what are you taking?" I told her. She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that the silence felt like something with a shape. "Together?" she asked. "At those doses?" I said yes. She folded her napkin very carefully and said she wanted to look something up when we got home. She never got the chance. Robert came back with pie and Nora caught herself, and the conversation moved on the way holiday conversations do, and I told myself I was imagining the look on her face. 3 days later, Nora drove back to Columbus. 2 weeks after that, she called me from the road and said something I didn't understand until much later. She said, "Mum, I found something. I'm going to send it to Aunt Claire. Don't react when it comes. Just read it." The call lasted 40 seconds. I didn't hear from her again for 11 days. On the 12th day, I got a call from a hospital in Cleveland. There had been an accident. Nora's car, a stretch of ice on Route 71. She was alive, the nurse told me, stable, but she had a concussion, 2 broken ribs, and wouldn't be released for several days. I was in my coat and at the door in 4 minutes. Robert appeared at the top of the stairs and told me he'd drive. He said it calmly, the way he said everything, and I was so frightened for Nora that I handed him my keys and climbed into the passenger seat of my own car without thinking. I didn't realize until we were 40 minutes north that I hadn't brought my phone. I asked Robert to pull over so I could use his. He said the hospital had everything under control and we'd be there soon. I said I wanted to call ahead to check on her. He said she was stable, there was no point, and he needed to focus on driving. His hands on the wheel were perfectly relaxed. Mine was shaking in my lap. When we got to the hospital, Nora was asleep, and the nurse at the desk said visiting hours were limited to immediate family. Robert presented his ID before I could find my wallet in my coat pocket. He filled out the paperwork. He answered the questions. He told the nurse I was her mother, and then in the same breath, too smooth, too practiced, he mentioned that I was under psychiatric care for a cognitive condition and might become upset, and that they should flag my file accordingly. I heard him say it. I turned and looked at him in the middle of that hospital hallway. He looked back at me with a face I had seen every morning for 22 years, a face I thought I knew like my own handwriting. And something in that face had moved, just slightly, like a wall that has been a door the whole time. I did not make a scene. I am a contracts attorney. I know the difference between the moment you react and the moment you act, and I know which one wins. I went in to see my daughter. Nora was pale and smaller looking in the hospital bed, one arm in a soft brace, a bruise across her forehead still purple at the edges. She was awake. She looked at me and then past me, and when she confirmed Robert had not come into the room, she grabbed my wrist with her good hand and pulled me close. "The combination I sent Aunt Claire," she whispered. "Did you get it?" I told her I didn't know what she meant. Her face changed. "Mum, I sent you a letter. A physical letter. White envelope. No return address. You didn't get it." I hadn't seen it, and in that moment I understood with cold, total clarity why I hadn't seen it. Robert handled the mail. He had always handled the mail. It had seemed considerate once, a small domestic thing, another form of patience I had mistaken for love. Nora made me lean closer. "Cabinet in the study," she said. "Bottom left. He changed the combination, but I saw the new one when I was home at Thanksgiving. I wrote it on a receipt and tucked it under the lining of your winter coat, the black one." She had known something was wrong at Thanksgiving. She had prepared for it silently, said nothing to me because she wasn't certain, and she had left me a key she hoped I'd never need. "What's in the cabinet?" I asked. Her hand tightened on my wrist. "Find it before he does," she said. "Don't let him know you're looking. Mom." She stopped, and what crossed her face then was not pain from the accident. It was fear. Real, awake, specific fear. "Dr. Voss isn't just your psychiatrist. I found her licensing records. She had a malpractice case in 2019. The patient filed for incompetency proceedings that got reversed on appeal." She swallowed. "The attorney on the other side of that case, the one fighting the incompetency ruling, was Robert." The room went very quiet. They had worked together before. This was not the first time. I drove home that night in a rental car, Robert beside me, both of us making the ordinary sounds of a worried husband and wife returning from a hospital visit. I asked appropriate questions about Nora's prognosis. He answered them. We stopped for gas. He bought me a coffee without asking how I took it, which was how I took it, because he had known for 22 years. I drank the coffee. I did not sleep. At 11:15, after his bedroom light had been dark for 40 minutes, I went downstairs in socked feet. I found my black winter coat in the hall closet. I ran my fingers under the lining on the left side until I felt the small, folded edge of a grocery receipt. The combination was 4 digits in Nora's handwriting, small and careful, like she'd been trying not to press too hard. I opened the cabinet, and that's when I found the insurance policy. $800,000. My name on the insured line. Robert's name in the beneficiary column. Issue date, 6 weeks prior. And clipped behind it, something that stopped my breathing entirely. A signed letter from Dr. Patricia Voss, on her official letterhead, dated 10 days ago. It stated that, in her professional opinion, I was exhibiting signs of significant cognitive decline, emotional instability, and an inability to manage my own financial affairs, and that she was formally recommending a psychiatric evaluation to determine whether a legal guardian should be appointed to oversee my estate. Not a divorce, not a separation, a guardianship proceeding, the legal mechanism by which a living person is declared unfit to control her own life, her own money, her own decisions. I had been a contracts attorney for 23 years. I knew exactly what a signed letter from a treating psychiatrist could do in a guardianship hearing, and I knew, standing barefoot in my own study at 11 at night, holding a flashlight and a dead man's game plan, that I had probably 60 days before he filed it, maybe less. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I went upstairs. I lay in the dark beside the man who had married me, watched me grieve my mother, handed me to a doctor who was already his, and I let me slowly, carefully, chemically blur, and I stared at the ceiling and I made myself breathe, and I thought about every document I had ever saved. Because here is what Robert did not know, what no one in that house knew, what I had never once mentioned in 22 years of marriage. When my mother died, she didn't just leave me money. She left me a letter, and in that letter was a name. The name in my mother's letter was Eleanor Marsh. I had read it once, the week after the funeral, sitting in my mother's kitchen with the estate papers spread across her table. I hadn't understood why she'd included it. Eleanor Marsh, she'd written, in the careful cursive she used for things that mattered. If you ever need someone who knows the whole truth, find her first. I'd folded the letter and put it in the fireproof box I kept in my closet, under my original law license and my mother's death certificate. I hadn't thought about Eleanor Marsh in 18 months. I thought about her now. I waited 4 days before I did anything. 4 days of breakfast at the same time, dinner at the same table, Robert reading the same architectural journals in the same chair. 4 days of Dr. Voss appointments I attended and medications I pretended to take, pressing each pill between my back teeth and tongue until I could dispose of it privately. I do not recommend this. I am not a doctor, but I was a woman who had just read a letter describing her own manufactured decline, and I needed my mind fully mine before I could use it. By day 3, the fog I'd been living in for 8 months had begun to lift at the edges. By day 4, I remembered who I used to be. I called Eleanor Marsh from a payphone outside a grocery store 12 miles from our house. There are almost no payphones left in Ohio. I had noted this one 6 months earlier when Robert drove past it, and something in me, some deeply buried professional instinct, had filed it away without knowing why. My hands did not shake when I dialed. Eleanor answered on the second ring, and before I could speak, she said, "I wondered when you'd call." She knew my name. She had been expecting me. I stood at that payphone in a parking lot in the thin November cold and understood that my mother had made a phone call of her own before she died. She had told Eleanor Marsh to wait. My mother had seen something I hadn't. Eleanor was 67, a retired family law judge from Franklin County, living now in a small house outside Granville with a wood stove and, as I would soon discover, the most organized filing system I had ever encountered outside of a federal courthouse. She told me to come alone, to leave my phone at home, and to tell Robert I was visiting a friend from the firm. "Don't pack anything," she said. "Just yourself and whatever you've already memorized." I memorized the insurance policy number, the date on Voss's letter, the balance figures from every joint account, and the deed registration number on our house before I closed that cabinet. I knew how to carry information without paper. 23 years of contracts work leaves that in your hands like muscle memory. I drove to Granville on a Tuesday, the grey kind that makes Ohio look like it was photographed in the 1970s. Eleanor met me at the door in reading glasses and a cardigan and handed me coffee before I sat down. Her living room had the particular order of a person who has spent a career separating the relevant from the irrelevant and never stops. I told her everything, every detail, from the first prescription to the hospital hallway to the cabinet to the policy. I spoke for 40 minutes without stopping, the way you speak when you've been chemically quieted for 8 months and your voice is finally climbing back to full volume. Eleanor listened without interrupting. She took no notes. She didn't need to. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her coffee cup and said, "Your mother came to me 3 years ago." I went still. She said she had noticed something in Robert, a pattern. She couldn't name it precisely, but she was a sharp woman, your mother, and she trusted what she noticed. Eleanor looked at me steadily. She asked me if there was a legal mechanism by which a spouse could be preemptively protected from a guardianship proceeding initiated by the other spouse. 3 years ago. My mother had seen it 3 years before the policy, before Voss, before the prescription pad, before the fog. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her yes," Eleanor said, "and I told her what documents you'd need." She stood, went to the filing cabinet against the far wall, and produced a folder I recognized before she opened it. It had my mother's name on the tab. Inside were 8 pages of handwritten notes in Eleanor's precise judicial hand, a roadmap for exactly the kind of proceeding Robert was about to initiate, and exactly how to dismantle it before it began. My mother had commissioned a defense for me 3 years before I knew I needed one. She had died before she could explain why. Now I was here to learn the blueprint she'd paid for. The strategy had 3 components, and Eleanor walked me through each one across the next 2 hours. First, document the medication protocol and obtain independent medical evaluation to establish that my cognitive presentation was pharmaceutical, not degenerative, induced, not inherent. Second, establish a paper record of Robert's financial behavior over the preceding 18 months, specifically any unusual transfers, beneficiary changes, or new accounts opened without my knowledge or signature. Third, find the 2019 case, the one Nora had mentioned, the patient Robert had helped defeat. Because if there was a pattern, there were records, and records in a legal proceeding are the only thing that cannot be rewritten by the person with the smoother voice. I drove home with a clean sheet of paper in my coat pocket, nothing written on it, and everything written in me. The medical piece moved faster than I expected because I had the advantage of knowing exactly what to say and to whom. I contacted a neurologist at Ohio State through a former colleague at the firm, not as Diane Calloway, the retired housewife, but as a former attorney with specific concerns about pharmaceutical interaction, and a pharmacology graduate student, my daughter, who had flagged the combination before her accident. The words "before her accident" sat on the phone call like stones. The neurologist heard them. He asked careful questions. He scheduled an evaluation for the following week under my maiden name, Diane Holt, at a satellite clinic 40 miles east. I told Robert I was visiting Nora. He offered to drive me. I said she preferred it, just the 2 of us. He accepted that with a smile that didn't reach the muscle beneath it, and I drove east alone and sat in a clean white examination room and answered questions with the clarity of a woman who had been quietly flushing her evening medication for 9 days. The neurologist's findings were unambiguous. There was no evidence of cognitive decline, no markers for early dementia, no neurological basis for the presentation Dr. Voss had documented. What he found instead was a textbook medication interaction pattern. 2 drugs at those dosages, combined over 8 months, producing exactly the symptoms Voss had recorded as evidence of deterioration: confusion, memory gaps, emotional flattening, difficulty concentrating. He used a specific word, iatrogenic, meaning caused by medical treatment itself. The decline was real. The cause was the prescription. He filed his report under my maiden name, printed 2 certified copies, and handed them to me in a sealed envelope with the clinic's letterhead. I put them inside a copy of a novel I'd brought in my bag. On the drive home, I finally let myself feel what I had been holding back for 2 weeks. Not grief, not fear, rage. The quiet, useful kind that doesn't shake your hands. The kind that clears your thinking the way cold air clears a room. I had given that man 22 years. I had set aside my career, my name professionally, my instincts, every quiet alarm that had rung and that I had silenced because I trusted him. And he had taken that trust and built a mechanism with it, piece by careful piece, using a woman I liked, a prescription pad, and my own retirement as the raw materials. He had watched me become smaller and called it decline. I merged onto the highway and drove the speed limit exactly and thought about the second component of Eleanor's plan, the financial records. I had a legal right to every joint account. That much was simple. What I needed was not the current balances, but the history. 18 months of transaction records, the full picture, every transfer and every payee. I requested them online through our joint banking portal that same evening, while Robert watched television 2 rooms away. I downloaded everything to a USB drive I'd bought for cash at a drugstore. What I found took me 3 hours to map. Robert had moved $340,000 out of our joint investment account over 14 months, not in large withdrawals that would flag immediately, in increments, 11,000 here, 14,000 there, always below the threshold that triggers automatic review. Patient, architectural, the way he did everything. The money had gone to a single LLC registered in Delaware. The LLC's registered agent address was a mailbox service in Scottsdale, Arizona. The LLC had been incorporated 20 months ago. I searched the name, found nothing publicly traceable. Then I searched the incorporation date against Robert's travel records, which I had access to through our shared calendar. He had been in Scottsdale for a conference that same week. I searched the conference. It was real. He had attended, but on the second day of the conference, according to the calendar, he had a blocked 4-hour window marked only with a single initial, V. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I pulled up Dr. Patricia Voss's professional profile and searched her history. She had been licensed in Arizona before Ohio. Her previous practice address was in Scottsdale. I closed the laptop. I sat in the kitchen in the dark. The refrigerator hummed. Down the hall, the television murmured. Everything in the house looked exactly as it always had, and none of it was what it appeared to be. They hadn't met because Robert was worried about my mental health. They had known each other for years. The third piece, the 2019 case, came together through a former paralegal from my old firm who owed me a favor I'd never called in. I called it in now, carefully, from Eleanor's landline on my next visit. She pulled the court records. The 2019 case was a woman named Sandra Pelletier, 61 at the time, a widow in Westerville whose stepchildren had initiated a guardianship proceeding against her 6 months after her husband's death. The treating psychiatrist supporting the petition had been an Arizona-licensed physician named Patricia Voss, who had relocated to Ohio practice that same year. The petition had nearly succeeded. Sandra Pelletier's own attorney had missed the connection between Voss and the stepchildren's estate attorney until 3 days before the hearing. The attorney who caught it, who pulled the financial records and found the shared LLC between Voss and the stepchildren's family trust and blew the proceeding apart in open court, had been a contracts attorney from Columbus referred at the last moment by a family law judge in Franklin County. The family law judge was Eleanor Marsh. The contracts attorney was my former colleague, my former partner, a woman named Grace Chen, who was still practicing, who was sharp as wire, and who picked up the phone on the first ring when I called her from Eleanor's kitchen and said, "Diane Calloway, I have been waiting for somebody to call me about Patricia Voss for 5 years. She already had the 2019 file. She had kept it. Grace had suspected Voss would surface again. She had built the case once and she had kept the architecture of it in a cabinet in her office because that is what careful attorneys do with patterns they expect to see repeated. She told me to come to her office Friday and to bring everything, the policy, the neurologist's report, the bank records, the LLC registration, and whatever else I had because we were going to build something that wouldn't just stop a guardianship proceeding. We were going to end Patricia Voss's license. I almost didn't make it to Friday. Thursday evening I came downstairs and found Robert in the study. The cabinet was open. He was standing with his back to me and the insurance policy in his hand, and for 1 second, the air in that room was the particular quality of a moment that cannot be undone. He heard me on the stairs and turned, and his face performed the expression I had seen him rehearse every day for 22 years. The calm, the consideration, the patient concern. "I was going to tell you about this," he said. I looked at the policy in his hand. The folder I had carefully replaced in the same position was sitting 2 inches from where I'd left it. He knew. He knew the cabinet had been opened. I said very quietly, "When?" He set the policy down on the desk and took 2 steps toward me, and his face shifted into something that had no name I could give it in 22 years of marriage, something that was neither the man I'd married nor the stranger I'd discovered, but the third thing entirely. the thing that had always been there beneath both of them. "I think," he said, "that you're having a difficult night. I think you should let me call Patricia." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought of Nora in that hospital bed, her hand tight on my wrist. I thought of my mother, sitting across from Eleanor Marsh 3 years before her death, quietly commissioning a defense for a daughter who didn't know she would need one. I thought about the neurologist's report in the novel in my closet, the bank records on the USB drive in the lining of my winter coat, the certified copies of the 2019 court file that Grace Chen had already scanned and saved to a server Robert had never heard of. I thought about 23 years of reading the fine print before the pen touched paper. Then I reached into my cardigan pocket and I set my phone on the desk between us, screen up, and I pressed play on the recording application I had opened 40 seconds earlier on the stairs when I'd heard him in that room. Every word he had said since I walked in was already saved. His face went very still. "Robert," I said gently, the way you'd correct a person who has fundamentally misread the room, "I think you should call your attorney." The hearing was scheduled 40 days later. He filed first, the way I knew he would, because a man who has been planning something for 2 years does not stop planning simply because the other person has woken up. He and Trent, his attorney, a man I had never met but whose filings I read like a familiar dialect, submitted Voss's letter, the medical documentation she'd built across 8 months, and a financial disclosure that conveniently omitted the Delaware LLC and $340,000 in moved assets. They walked into that courtroom expecting a woman who was confused, compliant, and chemically softened. Grace and I had spent 40 days making sure that woman no longer existed.